It was a cold, gray afternoon in Chicago, the kind where the air felt as though it was holding its breath before the evening snowfall. The streets, slick from an earlier rain, reflected the dull glow of the streetlights, while pedestrians rushed by, heads down against the biting wind. The city's hum was punctuated by the occasional honking of car horns and the distant murmur of hurried footsteps. Amidst this, in the corner of a cozy cafe, sat James Harris, a single dad in his late 30s, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. His 2 kids, Emma and Luke, were sitting across from him, their eyes glued to their phones, trying to stave off boredom as they waited for their father to finish what felt like another obligatory coffee break. James wasn't a fan of this cafe. Not really. It was too noisy, too crowded. But it was the only place nearby that didn't require a reservation, and with the constant juggling of work and parenting, a quiet moment for himself was a rare luxury. He had just finished a long shift at the auto repair shop, and was grateful for the small respite, even if it was only for a few minutes before the next chore waited. As James stared out the window, the world outside seemed to blend into one gray mass, and the aroma of brewing coffee did little to ease the weight on his shoulders. 3 years had passed since his wife, Claire, passed away unexpectedly. That night had left a mark on him, one that he carried everywhere, especially on days like this, when fatigue of parenting alone seemed to threaten his resolve. But then, a subtle shift in the air caught his attention. The door of the cafe swung open with a creak, a figure limping inside, her crutches tapping softly against the floor. James barely glanced at her at first, too lost in his own thoughts. But as she moved past the tables, there was something about her that made him look up. The young woman, probably in her mid-30s, was wearing a worn-out jacket, her face tired, with an expression that reflected a lifetime of quiet struggles. She wasn't like the usual patrons who came and went without leaving much of an impression. There was a sense of resilience in the way she carried herself, despite the evident exhaustion in her eyes. She stopped by an empty table, hesitated, and looked around the crowded room. The cafe was full, but no one seemed to notice her. People deliberately turned their gaze away, pretending to be engrossed in their own conversations or their phones. It wasn't out of malice. It was simply how people in this part of the city had learned to navigate their days. But James noticed. Her movements were careful, measured, as if every step she took cost her something. The prosthetic leg beneath her jeans was a kind of visible reminder that no one could ignore, but most chose to. The slight tremble in her hand as she adjusted her crutches caught his eye, and something deep inside him stirred. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the exhaustion in her eyes or the way she looked so out of place in a cafe full of people. But he couldn't ignore the pull to do something. For a moment, he wrestled with his own hesitation. Should he offer her the seat? Was it his place to intervene? His mind raced with thoughts of his own kids, who barely seemed to notice the world outside their screens. But there was something about this woman, a presence that was impossible to ignore. Then she spoke. "Excuse me." Her voice was small, almost timid. She turned to James, her gaze meeting his with a mix of vulnerability and quiet determination. "Can I sit here?" The question was simple enough, yet it was laced with something deeper, something raw, as though this woman had been used to being overlooked, ignored, and had finally worked up the courage to ask for something she knew she might not get. James hesitated for a second. He didn't want to make her feel like she was a burden, but something inside him pushed him to do the right thing, to offer her a space where she wouldn't feel invisible. He shifted in his chair, sliding it back slightly to create room. He motioned to the empty seat across from him. "Of course," he said, his voice steady, though he could feel the unease building in his chest. It wasn't that he was afraid of her or uncomfortable with her condition. He just wasn't used to these kinds of moments anymore. His life had become a series of routines and responsibilities, and moments of real human connection had become rarer and rarer. She smiled, though it was fleeting. She lowered herself carefully into the chair, her crutches resting on the floor beside her. There was a soft sigh of relief that escaped her lips, almost imperceptible, but to James, it spoke volumes. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James watched as she adjusted her position, clearly uncomfortable. Her jeans were frayed at the cuffs, and her jacket, though warm, looked like it had seen better days. He couldn't help but notice how tired she seemed, like she had been carrying a weight that wasn't visible to anyone else. He could relate to that feeling more than he liked to admit. "My name's James," he said, breaking the silence, unsure what else to say. She looked up, her eyes meeting his again, this time with a hint of curiosity. "Mara," she replied, her voice steady but laced with a quiet strength. "Mara Daniels." James nodded, giving her a small smile. They sat there for a moment, the sounds of the cafe swirling around them, but neither of them seemed to mind. It was a rare moment of peace for both of them. As Mara picked up her cup of coffee, James couldn't help but notice how fragile she looked, how the weight of the world seemed to hang on her shoulders, even in the smallest of gestures. And he couldn't shake the feeling that, in some way, this was a turning point, maybe for her, but also for him. It wasn't just the tiredness in her eyes. It was something deeper, something that spoke to the core of his own exhaustion. He could feel it, a shared burden, an understanding that transcended words. But what could he do? What could he possibly offer her that would make a difference in the face of everything she had already endured? Mara seemed to sense the unspoken question. She set her cup down gently, looking at James with an expression that was almost unreadable. "I don't mean to impose," she said quietly, "but do you think I could? Would it be all right if I shared your table? It's been a long day." James looked at her, seeing not just a woman in need of a seat, but a person whose life had been shaped by hardship, who had spent far too much time carrying the weight of the world alone. "You're not imposing," he said firmly. "We've all had long days." The words came out more easily than he expected, and it was then that he realized he wasn't just offering her a place to sit. He was offering her a moment of peace, a brief respite from the isolation that life seemed to impose on them both. As Mara smiled, though it was small, James knew this was only the beginning of a story that would change them both in ways they couldn't yet understand. The emotional distance between them, what had seemed so vast just a moment ago, had begun to close, and with it, something in James stirred. It wasn't just the simple kindness of offering a seat. It was a recognition of a shared struggle, a shared humanity. It was a realization that sometimes the smallest act of kindness could make all the difference. The cafe felt a little quieter now, the chatter around them fading into a distant hum as James and Mara sat across from each other. The warmth from the cafe contrasted sharply with the cold, gray world outside. James could feel a subtle shift in the air, a change in the rhythm of the day. It wasn't just the space between them that had shrunk. It was something deeper, something unspoken that both of them recognized. They had both arrived here with their own burdens, each of them carrying unseen weights. Yet somehow, in that small cafe, they were sharing a moment of calm together. Mara shifted in her seat, adjusting her crutches, and for a brief moment, James saw a flicker of discomfort in her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was enough to tell him that, despite her outward appearance of strength, she was carrying far more than her prosthetic leg. He could see it in the way her shoulders were slightly hunched, the tension in her hands as she gripped the cup of coffee. The weight of something invisible, something heavy, was pressing down on her. James wasn't sure what to say. His natural instinct was to give her space, to let her open up in her own time. But the silence between them had stretched long enough that he felt the need to fill it with something. He had always been one for small talk, but something told him that wasn't what she needed. So, instead of asking the usual, "How's your coffee?" he decided to take a different approach. "You're not from here, are you?" James asked gently, his voice almost apologetic as he tried to break the silence. "I don't mean to be intrusive, but you look like you're not used to sitting in places like this." Mara looked up at him, her brow furrowing slightly. There was a moment of hesitation before she spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "No," she said softly, "I'm not really a cafe person." She paused, her gaze dropping to her coffee cup. I'm used to moving, you know? No time to sit down and relax." James nodded, understanding more than she realized. He wasn't much of a cafe person either, not since Claire had passed away. But something about this moment, the simple act of sitting together, the shared solitude in the midst of the chaos of life, felt like something they both needed. "Yeah, I get that," James said, his voice low. "Life doesn't exactly come with a pause button, does it?" Mara's eyes flickered toward him, a subtle recognition in her gaze. "No," she replied, "it doesn't." They fell into a quiet rhythm after that, both of them lost in their own thoughts. James couldn't help but wonder about Mara's story. What had brought her to this point? What had made her walk into this cafe with a quiet determination that he could almost feel? And why had she chosen to sit with him, of all people? He glanced at her again, this time taking in the details that told a deeper story. Her clothes were worn, not in a way that suggested carelessness, but in the way of someone who had been through a lot. The frayed cuffs of her jeans, the fading color of her jacket, all spoke of years of use, of days and nights spent in survival mode rather than comfort. Her hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, as though she had neither the time nor the energy to care about how it looked. And the faint scent of rain still clung to her, reminding of the cold, relentless world outside. "Do you live around here?" James asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. He didn't mean to pry, but there was something about her presence that made him feel like he needed to know her story. Not out of curiosity, but because he understood what it was like to feel invisible. Mara hesitated before answering, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. She looked down at her hands, almost as if she were trying to decide whether to speak or not. For a moment, James thought she might not respond. But then she did. "I live about 10 blocks away," she said, her voice still quiet. "But it's not home. Not really. It's just a place I go when I need to sleep." She paused, her gaze lifting to meet his, her eyes carrying a vulnerability that made James feel like he was hearing something deeply personal. "It's where I've always been, but it's not really where I belong." James felt his heart tighten at her words. He had been there before, had been in that space where home didn't feel like home, where the weight of everything you were carrying made you question if you even had a place to belong. It was a place of isolation, where no matter how many people were around, you still felt utterly alone. "I get it," James said, his voice soft but firm. "I think a lot of us feel that way sometimes." He paused, his mind flashing to his own situation. He hadn't exactly had a home since Claire had passed, not in the way that felt whole. The house they had shared was still there, but it felt hollow, filled with memories that were both comforting and haunting. He had Emma and Luke, of course, but there were moments when the silence of their home became overwhelming. Mara glanced at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, as if the silence had been broken by some invisible force, she let out a soft sigh and looked back at her cup. "It's hard," she said quietly. "It's hard to keep going when it feels like no one really sees you, you know?" She let the words hang in the air, a quiet admission of something she hadn't said out loud in a long time. James didn't know what to say to that. He had been in that place, too, where you put on a brave face of the world, pretending everything was fine, when inside you were barely holding it together. But he couldn't pretend with Mara. There was no need for that. He could feel her pain, the weight she carried, and it mirrored his own in a way that made the air between them crackle with unspoken understanding. "Yeah," he said, his voice low and steady. "I think we've all been there." The words hung between them, an acknowledgement of shared pain, of struggles that felt too heavy to bear alone. And for the first time in a long time, James felt like he wasn't alone, like someone else understood, even if only for this fleeting moment. Mara didn't speak again, but her expression softened. The tension in her shoulders seemed to ease just a little. The world outside continued to rush by, but in that small corner of the cafe, time seemed to slow down. James looked at her, the weight of his own burdens pressing down on him. But he didn't feel the usual urge to pull away, to retreat into his own world. For once, he felt a connection that he hadn't expected, one that came from a place of shared humanity and quiet understanding. "Thank you," Mara said quietly, breaking the silence, "for sitting with me." James met her gaze, his heart heavy with the unspoken understanding that had passed between them. "No need to thank me," he replied. "We all need someone to sit with us sometimes." The cafe was beginning to empty out, the steady hum of conversations and clinking coffee cups slowly fading as the late afternoon wore on. Outside, the sky was deepening into a dusky blue, and the first few snowflakes had begun to fall, adding to gray landscape. The world felt quieter somehow, as if it, too, had settled into a rhythm that matched the warmth of the cafe's interior. James and Mara were still seated at their table, though now the space between them felt more comfortable, less tentative. Mara had finished her coffee and was fiddling with the edge of her cup, her fingers tracing the cracks in the ceramic as if lost in thought. James watched her for a moment, wondering what was going on inside her mind. There was so much he didn't know about her, so much she had yet to share. But for some reason, in this moment, he didn't feel the need to ask. He could tell that she wasn't ready to open up completely. There was a quiet, guarded energy about her, as though she had learned to keep the weight of her story hidden behind walls she wasn't ready to tear down. But as the minutes passed, he noticed something in her. The way her posture slowly shifted, how the tension in her shoulders seemed to loosen bit by bit. She wasn't the same woman who had entered the cafe just over an hour ago. She was softer now, less rigid, like a flower slowly unfurling after a long stretch of cold, harsh weather. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" James said quietly, his voice calm but sincere. Mara looked up at him, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked, his steady, hers uncertain, as if she had to decide whether or not to allow him to see her vulnerability. She blinked, then gave a small nod, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Yeah," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I have." James didn't press her any further. He knew better than to push. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath, as if searching for the right words. He didn't want to make her feel like she had to explain herself, but he couldn't help but wonder just what had brought her to this point. The pain she was carrying, the silent battle she fought every day. There was a part of him that felt a strained connection to her, one that came from his own life of struggle and survival. "I've been a single dad for 3 years now," James said after a pause, deciding to share a little of his own story. He wasn't sure why he was opening up, but something about Mara's quiet presence made it feel easier to do so. "My wife, Claire, passed away suddenly, and it's been tough. Raising 2 kids, trying to juggle work, trying to make sense of everything." Mara's gaze softened, and she sat up straighter, her crutches shifting slightly on the floor. She seemed to be processing his words, though she said nothing in response. James wasn't expecting her to. He didn't need her to share her pain with him. Not yet, anyway. But he did need to let her know that she wasn't alone, that the weight she carried wasn't as isolating as it felt. "I understand," Mara finally said, her voice quieter than before. "It's hard. You get so used to carrying things alone, you forget what it feels like to let someone else help." The words struck a chord in James, and for the first time since their conversation began, He saw something more in Mara's eyes, a flicker of understanding, a shared truth. She wasn't just talking about her own burdens. She was speaking to the universal experience of being weighed down by life, of holding everything inside because you didn't know how to let it out. James nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers. Yeah, we don't realize how heavy it gets until we're running on empty, right? And then, when someone offers to share the load, we don't know how to take it. Mara shifted again, looking down at her hands. She didn't speak for a long moment, but James could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was processing, piecing together the fragments of her own truth. People don't want to see the cracks, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. They don't want to see the parts of you that are broken. They don't want to see how tired you are, how scared you are. So you learn to hide it. You learn to put on a mask and pretend everything's fine. James felt a pang of recognition deep in his chest. He knew that feeling all too well. For the past 3 years, he had worn his own mask, smiling through the days, pretending that everything was under control. But behind the smile, there was always a quiet ache, an emptiness that he had no idea how to fill. You don't have to wear a mask around me, James said, his voice soft but steady. Not here. Mara met his gaze again, and this time, the vulnerability in her eyes was unmistakable. It was a rare thing to see someone so open about their pain, and for a moment, James felt like he had been let into a secret part of her world, a world that she kept hidden from most people, from the rest of the world that moved too fast to care. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The world outside seemed to quiet even further as the evening wore on, and the snow outside began to fall more heavily, blanketing the city in a soft, white silence. Inside the cafe, it was as if time itself had slowed, leaving only the quiet companionship between them. Eventually, Mara broke the silence again, her voice almost a whisper. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't know how to keep going. James could feel the weight of her words settle in his chest. He didn't know how to fix it, how to make things better for her. But for the first time since Claire's passing, he didn't feel like he was completely alone in this world. Mara's pain echoed his own, and in that shared moment, he felt the walls around his own heart begin to crumble just a little. You're not alone, James said, his voice quiet but resolute. And you don't have to carry everything on your own. Not anymore. Mara looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It wasn't pity she saw in his gaze. It was understanding, empathy, a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes simply being seen is all it takes to begin healing. For the first time since she had walked into the cafe, Mara allowed herself to breathe, to let go of the tension that had gripped her for so long. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't known she was missing. Hope. The snow outside had grown heavier, a steady curtain of white that blurred the edges of the city. James glanced out the window for a moment, his thoughts adrift in the quiet swirl of winter outside. The cafe had grown quieter as the evening settled in, the remaining patrons speaking in hushed tones as they wrapped up their conversations and gathered their coats. Inside, the warmth of the cafe, the comforting hum of distant chatter, and the soft glow of the lights had created an almost surreal sense of stillness between James and Mara. Despite the bustle around them, there was a sense of intimacy in the space they shared, a quiet understanding that had taken root between them, one that neither of them had expected. Mara was still sitting across from him, her hands now resting in her lap, her eyes cast downward as if lost in thought. Her crutches leaned against a chair beside her, the faint rattle of the metal against the floor, the only sound breaking the silence between them. James couldn't help but study her for a moment. There was a kind of strength in the way she sat there, even in the quiet. It wasn't the kind of strength that came from outward displays of confidence. It was quieter, more resilient, like the stillness of a tree standing tall through the harshest winds. So what happens next? James asked, his voice low, as though he didn't want to disturb the delicate atmosphere between them. Mara's eyes flickered up to meet his, the vulnerability still there, but now it was mixed with something else, a kind of resolve, something more hopeful than she had shown before. "I don't know," she replied, her voice steady. "I've been so used to pushing through everything on my own that sometimes I forget what it feels like to lean on someone else." James nodded, his gaze softening. "I think we all forget that sometimes. It's easier to carry the weight on your own, even if it's too much. But it's also harder that way." Mara hesitated for a moment, her fingers curling around the edges of her coffee cup, before she spoke again. "I guess I've just been afraid. Afraid that if I let someone help me, they'll see how much I'm struggling, how much I've failed." The words hit James like a quiet storm. He knew that feeling all too well. The fear of being seen as weak, the worry that opening up would make you more vulnerable. "You haven't failed," James said, his voice firm, though he understood how easily that self-doubt could creep in. "It's not about being strong all the time. Sometimes it's about letting people in, letting them see the parts of you that are broken, even if you're afraid they'll judge you for it." Mara's gaze dropped again, her eyes momentarily flickering with something that almost looked like shame, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, as though the weight of her own thoughts had become too much to bear on her own. "Sometimes I feel like I'm pretending," she admitted quietly. "Like I'm pretending to be okay, like I'm pretending that I've got everything together. But inside, I'm just falling apart." James could feel the rawness in her words, the truth behind them that was so often left unspoken. The pressure to appear perfect, to hold it all together, was something he understood deeply. He had spent years pretending, trying to convince himself that he could handle everything, his job, his kids, his grief, without ever asking for help. "I know what that feels like," he said softly. "We're all pretending to some degree. But pretending doesn't get you anywhere. At some point, you have to stop running from what's really going on." Mara looked at him, her eyes wide, as if his words had hit a nerve. She opened her mouth to say something, but then paused, her gaze drifting to the window, where the snow had begun to fall faster, covering the city in a blanket of white. It was a peaceful sight, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts that seemed to swirl inside her. James watched her closely, sensing that she was on the verge of something, some realization, some shift in her thinking. He didn't rush her. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, giving her the space to think, to process, and to come to her own conclusions. After a few moments, Mara sighed, her shoulders slumping as if some invisible weight had lifted just a little. I guess I've been afraid that if I stop pretending, everything will fall apart. But maybe it's already falling apart." James leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his hands clasped together. "It doesn't have to fall apart," he said gently. "It can come together. But you have to be willing to stop holding it all in, to trust that it's okay to let go sometimes." For a long time, Mara didn't respond. Instead, she sat quietly, her mind clearly at work, sifting through the emotions and realizations that had begun to surface. James didn't rush her. He understood that healing, in whatever form it took, had its own timeline. It wasn't something you could force or hurry along. The door to the cafe swung open with sharp jingle, and the sound of footsteps in the snow-filled air briefly interrupted their moment. But Mara didn't flinch or pull away. She sat there calm, her thoughts drifting, but for the first time in a long time, it seemed like she was finally allowing herself to process everything she had been holding inside. She wasn't pretending anymore. "I've been so focused on surviving, on making sure I don't let anyone down, that I forgot what it feels like to actually live," Mara said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it was filled with a quiet realization. "Maybe it's time I stopped surviving and started living." James smiled, though it was a small, knowing smile, the kind that only came after you've been to the fire yourself and come out on the other side. "I think you're already doing it," he said softly. Mara looked up at him, her eyes holding a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "You really think so?" "I know so," James replied, his voice steady. "It's not about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about being willing to move forward, even when it feels like you can't. And you're already taking that first step." Mara sat back in her chair, her hands resting lightly on the table. She wasn't smiling yet, but there was a sense of relief in her eyes, a softness that hadn't been there before. For the first time since they had started talking, she looked lighter. "I think I can do that," she said quietly, the first real spark of hope in her voice. James nodded. "You can, and if you need someone to sit with you while you take the next step, you've got me." For the first time in a long while, Mara believed him. The snow outside had thickened, covering the streets in a dense, untouched layer. Chicago had transformed into a winter wonderland, the kind of quiet beauty that made the city seem almost peaceful, despite its usual rush. The cafe, too, had taken on a cozier, more intimate feeling. The air inside felt warmer now, not just from the heat, but from the conversation, the quiet exchange of thoughts and emotions that had been building ever since James and Mara had sat down together. They had been talking for what felt like hours, but in truth, it had only been an hour and a half. Time seemed to slip by unnoticed, as they shared parts of themselves they hadn't let anyone else see in a long time. James had never been good at letting people in, not after losing Claire. But Mara had a way of making him feel like it was okay to open up, to let go of the walls he'd built around himself. And as they talked, it became clear that the walls around Mara's heart were starting to fall, too. The conversation had shifted now, moving from the personal to the practical. Mara had told James about her life in the city, how she had moved here years ago with her mother after her father had left them. They had lived in a small, crumbling apartment on the outskirts of the city, where the rent was cheap, but the environment was anything but. It was a neighborhood that made you feel like you were constantly holding your breath, never quite sure if you were safe or if you were just getting by. "I never thought I'd make it this far," Mara said, her voice quiet but filled with a certain strength. She was looking out the window now, watching the snowflakes fall, her gaze distant, as if she were seeing something far beyond the cafe's walls. "I always thought I'd be stuck there, you know? Just another person the world doesn't notice, another person living on the edge." James felt the weight of her words settle on his chest. He knew what it felt like to be stuck, to feel like you were drowning in the responsibilities and the sadness of life. He had spent so many years just trying to stay afloat, to keep things together for his kids, that he had lost sight of what it meant to live. He had forgotten that, even in the middle of all the mess, there was still beauty in the small moments, in the connections that could be made when you least expected them. "I used to feel the same way," James said, his voice gentle. "After Claire passed, I didn't know how to keep going. I didn't know if I could. But you do. You just keep going. Even when it feels like everything's falling apart, you keep putting one foot in front of the other." Mara turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for some kind of confirmation. "How do you do it?" she asked, her voice small, almost uncertain. "How do you keep going when it feels like the weight of everything is too much?" James paused, his gaze dropping to his hands for a moment. The truth was, he didn't always know. There were days when it felt impossible, when the weight of his grief and his responsibilities was so overwhelming that he didn't know how he'd make it through. But somehow he did. Maybe it was because of Emma and Luke, maybe because he had no other choice. But there was something else too, something Mara needed to hear. "I do it because I have to," he said, looking back up at her, his voice steady. "I do it because I have people who depend on me. I have a family to take care of, and even on the hardest days, I can't give up on them. But I think More than anything, I do it because I have to believe that there's something better waiting, that there's still something good in this world. Mara looked down at her hands, her fingers curling around the edges of her crutches as though she were trying to ground herself in his words. I don't know if I believe in that, she said quietly. I've spent so much time just surviving, just making it through the day, that I forgot what it feels like to believe in something better. Maybe I don't even know what that looks like anymore. James leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. I get that, he said. Sometimes, just making it through the day is all we can do. But you don't have to do it alone, Mara. And you don't have to have it all figured out. Not yet. Mara's eyes met his, and for the first time since they started talking, there was something in her gaze that looked like hope, quiet, tentative, but real. It wasn't a bright, shining hope, the kind that came from some grand revelation or dramatic shift in life. It was a kind of hope that could only come from someone who had spent so long in the darkness that even the faintest glimmer of light felt like a miracle. I don't know how to let people in, Mara said, her voice breaking the silence between them. I've been on my own for so long. But I think maybe I'm starting to understand that I don't have to do everything alone. James nodded slowly, his gaze steady. You don't have to do anything alone. You've got me, Mara, and you've got your family. You just have to let people help you. You have to let them see you, not just the person you think you should be, but the real you. And the real you is strong more than you know. Mara's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, James thought she might say something more. But instead, she just sat there, her eyes distant again, as if she were processing his words. It was clear she wasn't ready to fully open up, but James didn't push her. He wasn't there to fix her. He was there to show her that she didn't have to carry everything by herself. I've never let anyone see the real me, Mara said, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I can. James leaned back in his chair, giving her the space she needed. You don't have to right now, he said. Just know that whenever you're ready, you can, and I'll be here. The weight of the words hung in the air between them, a quiet promise that neither of them fully understood, but both of them felt. The world outside the cafe continued to snow, and the evening deepened into night. But inside, for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of peace, a sense that, even in the darkest moments, there was still room for light. The cafe had emptied out now. It was just James and Mara, the only two left in the warm, dimly lit space. Outside, the world was covered in snow, a stark contrast to the soft glow of the cafe's interior. The bustle of the city, the noise of everyday life, had been replaced with a quiet calm that neither of them had expected to find that day. Yet, in the stillness, there was a growing understanding between them, a connection that neither had anticipated. James sat back in his chair, watching as Mara absent-mindedly traced the rim of her empty coffee cup, her fingers lingering on the surface. He could tell that her mind was elsewhere, that she was lost in thoughts he couldn't fully understand. The quiet vulnerability she had shared earlier, her admission of feeling alone, of pretending for so long, was still lingering in the air. But now, there was a hesitation in her, something that told him she was on the verge of revealing more, of opening up further. The only question was whether she would be able to let go of the past long enough to embrace the possibility of something different. Mara, James said, his voice low but filled with care. You've been through a lot, I can tell. And I know it's not easy to let people in, especially when life's given you more than your share of pain. Mara looked up, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, James saw a flicker of something he hadn't noticed before, a mix of fear and something else, something close to hope. But it was fleeting, like a passing shadow, and quickly replaced with the familiar guardedness he had come to expect. She cleared her throat and shifted in her seat, her crutches resting against the side of her chair. Her hands were still clasped around her cup, her fingers tight around the porcelain, as if holding on to something she wasn't ready to let go of. "I don't know how to talk about it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so many years keeping inside that now, even when I want to let it out, I don't know where to start." James leaned forward slightly, his eyes soft but insistent. He wasn't rushing her, but he could feel the tension building in the room, the weight of the unspoken things that hung between them. "You don't have to tell me everything all at once," he said gently. "But whatever it is, whatever you've been carrying, I'm here. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Mara's gaze flickered toward the window again, her eyes distant as she stared out at the swirling snow. It was as though the outside world held a certain comfort for her, something familiar to latch onto when her emotions felt too overwhelming. For a long time, there was only silence. The sound of the snow falling outside was the only thing breaking the stillness, and James could sense the battle raging inside Mara, between the desire to open up and the fear of what that would mean. Finally, she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I've always been a strong one," she began, her words tentative, as though she were still trying to figure out how to let herself feel them. "My mom needed me to be. After my dad left, she was different. I don't think she ever fully recovered. So I had to be the one to hold things together. I had to be the one to take care of her. And I did.